The Galactic Empire had stood unchallenged for centuries, an unshakable colossus that had crushed countless civilizations beneath its inexorable march. It expanded not through diplomacy, but through the simple doctrine of overwhelming force. Worlds that resisted burned. Those that surrendered were enslaved. The lesson was clear. Power was the only language worth speaking. When humanity was discovered, the Empire's ruling council barely took notice. Reports indicated that humans were unremarkable, physically frail compared to the warlike Zeltari, lacking the regenerative abilities of the Voth-Kai, and far from the technological prowess of the Zenith Dominion. More damning than any biological shortcoming, however, was their tendency to seek peace first. The Council found this disgusting. A species that preferred treaties over war, that bent rather than resisted. They were nothing more than insects awaiting extermination. Grand Imperator Zelzereth sat atop his throne of polished obsidian, golden robes draped over his scaled frame, his slitted eyes gleaming with amusement as he regarded the emissary from Earth. The human was a thin, pale man in a modest navy blue suit, looking utterly insignificant before the assembly of the galaxy's most ruthless warlords. "You come before the might of the Empire," Zelzereth intoned, his deep voice carrying through the vast chamber. "Do you understand what that means?" The human cleared his throat. "I do. It means you are a dominant force in this region of space, one that has made its stance on conflict abundantly clear. We, however, do not seek war. Humanity is willing to negotiate peaceful terms for coexistence." Laughter rippled through the chamber, a deep, guttural sound from dozens of alien throats. The Imperator leaned forward, sharp teeth glinting as he smirked. "Peace. What a charming delusion." His clawed fingers tapped the armrest of his throne. "Do you know what we do to species that refuse to fight?" The human ambassador did not flinch. "I assume you destroy them." Zelzereth chuckled. "No. Destruction is mercy. We assimilate them into servitude. We break them. And when their young are born, they no longer remember the concept of defiance." His voice darkened. "Cowards deserve no better." There was a silence in the chamber, and the human stood unmoving. Finally, he exhaled softly. "Then it seems we have little more to discuss today." Zelzereth waved a dismissive hand. "You will return to your world. When next we meet, it will be upon the ruins of your cities." The ambassador nodded, turned on his heel, and walked out. The Empire's war machine mobilized soon after. The conquest of Earth was expected to be swift, a matter of days, perhaps weeks. Initial skirmishes only reinforced their arrogance. Human colonies on the fringes of the Empire's reach evacuated rather than resisted, their fleets retreating from engagements. Reports painted a picture of a species that refused to fight back, unwilling or incapable of standing against the might of the Imperium. Admiral Vorkal led the first major offensive, a fleet of 1,000 warships descending upon the planet of New Anchorage, one of humanity's more developed outer colonies. It was a strategic linchpin, the kind of world that, if taken, would cripple humanity's ability to mount a counteroffensive. The plan was simple: annihilate the orbital defenses, deploy ground forces, and accept the planet's inevitable surrender. Resistance was minimal. A few defense satellites fired desperate bursts of energy before being silenced. The human fleet stationed in orbit engaged briefly, but withdrew within minutes, vanishing in a slipspace like ghosts fleeing before the storm. Vorkal watched from the bridge of his flagship, bemused. "They don't even attempt to save their own," he mused, tail flicking in contempt. His second-in-command, a heavily armored warlord named Corven, snarled in agreement. "Pathetic. It is no wonder their species is weak. They flee like vermin before the flame." The invasion proceeded unhindered. Imperial legions stormed the planet, armored troops marching through cities abandoned before they had even arrived. There was no grand battle, no last stand. Even the planetary governor had fled. The conquest of New Anchorage was broadcast across the Empire as evidence of humanity's cowardice, and it was received with roaring approval. The campaign continued in much the same way. World after world fell with only token resistance. Humanity did not engage in direct war. They did not meet the Empire in the field. Instead, they abandoned their positions, ceded territory, and vanished. The Imperator grew bored. "This is not war," Zelzareth muttered in frustration as he watched another battle report scroll across his personal data slate. "This is slaughter." He turned to his advisors. "Where are their warriors?" "Perhaps they have none," one suggested with a dry laugh. But that did not sit well with Zelzareth. A species did not expand into space without struggle. Even the weakest civilizations had defenders willing to die for their home. Something was wrong. Then, the disappearances began. At first, they were dismissed as anomalies. Patrol squads that failed to report in. Outposts that went silent. A minor nuisance, nothing more. But then entire garrisons went missing overnight, their bases found abandoned with no signs of battle. High-ranking officers were discovered dead in their quarters, throats slit with surgical precision. Imperial commanders began whispering of an unseen force, something that struck in the darkness and left no trace. Fear crept into the ranks. Soldiers refused to patrol alone. Officers doubled their guards. But it did not matter. The attacks continued, growing bolder. A warlord overseeing an occupied city was found hanged from the tallest spire, his own ceremonial dagger driven through his chest. A dreadnought carrying thousands of Imperial troops vanished from hyperspace, only for its wreckage to be found drifting near a human colony, every single crew member missing. The Grand Imperator watched these developments with a slow, simmering fury. "Explain this to me," he demanded. "How does a species too cowardly to fight in open war suddenly possess the ability to strike at us without warning?" No one had an answer. A new message was broadcast from the remnants of humanity's leadership. It was short, simple, and chilling. Asterisk, "We heard you wanted to fight, so we sent the monsters you fear in the dark." Asterisk, the Empire had laughed at humanity. But now the laughter had stopped. The war had changed. The Empire didn't realize it yet, but the tide had already turned. Admiral Vorkal paced the command deck of his flagship, eyes fixed on the tactical display. The numbers told a story of absolute dominance. Hundreds of Imperial worlds secured, entire human colonies wiped from existence, their territories swallowed into the ever-expanding reach of the Imperium. And yet, the unease in his gut only grew stronger. Something was wrong. His forces had occupied human space for months now, and yet the enemy had not surrendered. They had not mounted a grand counteroffensive, nor had they begged for mercy. Instead, they had gone silent, slipping into the shadows. Every attempt to establish control over the occupied planets was met with the same unsettling pattern. Soldiers disappearing without a trace, supply routes compromised, command centers infiltrated, and high-ranking officials found dead in their own fortresses. It had begun as a whisper among the lower ranks. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the darkness, shadows where none should be. Entire garrisons spoke in hushed voices about the unseen executioners, the ghosts that slipped past defenses as if the laws of reality did not apply to them. The name had spread like wildfire through the ranks. The Boogeymen. Vorkal hated superstition, but even he could not ignore the reports piling up before him. These were not isolated incidents. This was something coordinated, something far beyond mere resistance fighters or desperate insurgents. The humans were not simply fighting back. They were hunting. On the surface of Vos Prime, an occupied human colony turned Imperial staging ground. Commander Zyrek prepared for the night patrol. He had doubled the number of guards after the last incident. An entire squad of soldiers had vanished during routine patrol, their bodies found at dawn with their throats sliced open, their weapons still holstered. Zyrek was no fool. He had seen battle across countless worlds, crushed rebellions with an iron fist. He had fought creatures that could tear a man apart with their bare hands. Yet nothing unnerved him quite like the idea of an enemy he could not see. The city was quiet, unnaturally so. The humans who remained had learned not to be caught outside after dark. The streetlights cast long, wavering shadows against the ruined buildings. Zyrek's forces moved in tight formations, weapons raised, scanning every alley and rooftop. Then, the first scream cut through the night. It came from the far end of the street, abrupt and strangled. The patrol turned, weapons locking onto the last known position of their comrade. Nothing. No gunfire, no signs of a struggle, just silence. The squad leader barked a command, and they advanced cautiously, stepping over the cracked pavement, scanning every possible vantage point. A second scream, this time closer. Zyrek gritted his teeth, adrenaline pumping through his veins. His men were the best the Empire had to offer, trained in the art of war, their armor impervious to most small arms fire. And yet, something was cutting through them as if they were nothing. A faint rustle, a flicker of movement. Zyrek turned just in time to see a figure drop from the shadows above, a blur of matte black armor and fluid motion. A knife flashed, and a soldier's throat opened in a red gash before he could react. Gunfire erupted, but the attackers were already gone, melting into the darkness before a single shot found its mark. Then they were everywhere. They struck with precision, their attacks planned down to the last detail. Snipers eliminated officers before orders could be given. Explosives ripped through supply lines, turning once secure strongholds into death traps. They moved without sound, left no footprints, no survivors. Panic set in. Imperial soldiers, once drunk on their own superiority, now flinched at every shadow. Sleep became a luxury. Morale shattered. No one knew when or where the Boogeymen would strike next. Grand Imperator Zalzareth slammed a clawed fist onto the marble table, his rage barely contained. "Explain this to me," he growled, his golden eyes burning into the gathered warlords. "How is it that we are losing soldiers by the thousands when the enemy has no fleet, no strongholds, no army?" No one spoke. "Speak." Admiral Vorkal exhaled sharply. "They're not fighting us in a conventional war, Imperator. They are targeting our leadership, our logistics, our very ability to maintain control." Zalzareth's jaw tightened. "Terror tactics." "Yes," Vorkal confirmed. "But more than that, they are precise. Surgical. This is not random resistance. These are trained killers, operating on a scale we have never encountered before." The Imperator's claws tapped against the table, his mind racing. He had underestimated humanity. He had thought them weak, but weakness did not create warriors like these. He knew fear when he saw it, and his soldiers, his elite warriors, were afraid. Somewhere in the darkness of space, aboard an unseen human warship, Colonel Daniel Graves studied the latest intelligence reports. His team had been in deep space for months now, operating behind enemy lines, striking at the heart of the Empire's occupation forces. They had no uniforms, no insignias, no recorded presence in any official military database. If captured, they did not exist, but their work spoke for itself. His second-in-command, Captain Ramirez, leaned against the steel wall of the war room, arms crossed. "They're scared," she noted, watching the footage from a captured Imperial helmet cam. It was a chaotic mess of screams and gunfire, ending in static. "They should be," Graves replied. He glanced down at the message intercepted from Imperial High Command. It was brief but telling. Orders for immediate withdrawal from multiple occupied planets. The mighty Empire, undefeated for centuries, was pulling back. It wasn't enough. Not yet. They wanted a war, Graves murmured. They just didn't know what kind. Ramirez smirked. "And we're going to teach them." Outside, the warship drifted in the void, unseen, undetected. The next mission was already planned. Another strike, another world, another reminder that the Boogeymen were real, and the Empire had just begun to understand what true fear felt like. The Empire was unraveling. The signs were everywhere: fractured supply lines, abandoned garrisons, warlords turning on one another in desperate bids to maintain control. The once mighty fleet that had blackened the skies of 100 conquered worlds was now fractured, retreating from human space with a haste that bordered on panic. The whispers of the Boogeymen had become a deafening roar, their legend spreading like wildfire through the ranks. Entire divisions refused deployment. Officers, once unwavering in their loyalty, now looked over their shoulders in fear of assassins that never announced their arrival. The greatest empire the galaxy had ever known was bleeding out, and the wound was entirely unseen. In the imperial capital of Zarek Prime, Grand Imperator Zelzereth stood before a war council that had once been filled with confidence and arrogance, but was now reduced to bitter silence. The holodeble before them flickered, displaying a growing list of lost territories, defecting officers, and supply shortages. His golden eyes burned with fury, yet beneath his rage, a quiet, unfamiliar sensation coiled in his gut. Dread. "They are not gods," he growled, slamming a clawed fist onto the table. "They are not invincible. They are humans, weak, frail, short-lived creatures. We have crushed species far greater than them. So tell me, Admiral Vorkal, why is it that we are losing?" Vorkal, once the Empire's most celebrated tactician, hesitated before speaking. His usual confidence had eroded under the weight of months of relentless attacks. The Boogeymen had dismantled their infrastructure with terrifying precision, cutting off supply lines, eliminating key personnel, and turning once loyal worlds into powder kegs of unrest. It was not a war of grand battles. It was a war of annihilation, fought in the dark, where the Empire's strength meant nothing. "They do not fight as we do, Imperator," Vorkal admitted at last. "They do not seek to conquer. They seek to erase us." Zelzereth bared his teeth. "Then we give them no quarter. We burn their homeworld. We remind them who rules this galaxy." A voice cut through the chamber, cold and steady. "You won't make it that far." The warlords moved as one, weapons drawn, eyes scanning for the intruder. But they never saw him, not until he wanted to be seen. From the shadows of the council chamber, Colonel Daniel Graves stepped forward. His armor, black as the void, seemed to shift in the dim light. There was no insignia, no markings, just the quiet, measured presence of a man who had walked through fire and emerged as something more. He had been in this room for hours, watching, listening. The Boogeymen did not rely on brute force. They did not storm fortresses. They walked through them. The Imperator's guards moved, but before they could fire, a single metallic clink echoed through the chamber, a small cylindrical device rolling to a stop at Zelzereth's feet. The Imperator had fought countless battles, and yet, in this moment, for the first time in his long, brutal life, he hesitated. The flashbang detonated in a burst of blinding white. Gunfire erupted. Suppressed rounds cut through the air with quiet efficiency. The warlords, trained for open combat, flailed against an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. When the light faded, Zelzereth found himself alone, his finest warriors lying still around him, their bodies cooling against the polished floor. And Graves was still there. The Imperator lunged, claws outstretched, but Graves moved with the precision of a man who had already won. A step to the side, a twist, a knife flashing upward. Zelzereth staggered back, a deep gash across his arm. He snarled, fury and disbelief warring within him. "You think this changes anything?" he spat, blood dripping onto the floor. "Kill me, and another will rise. The Empire cannot die." Graves tilted his head, watching him with that same unreadable expression. Then he took a step closer, voice calm, almost clinical. "The Empire is already dead. You just haven't accepted it yet." Zelzereth roared, launching himself forward in a final, desperate attack. But Graves had already raised his sidearm. The shot rang out, echoing through the silent chamber. The Imperator staggered, clutching at the hole in his chest, eyes wide with something that might have been surprise. He sank to his knees. Graves crouched beside him, voice quiet. "You shouldn't have called us cowards." Zelzereth exhaled one last breath, then crumpled forward, the weight of his failure heavier than the death itself. Outside, the Imperial Palace was already in flames. The capital was collapsing, its people realizing, too late, that the war had never been fought in open battlefields, but in the spaces between. The Boogeymen had not come to defeat the Empire. They had come to erase it. Across the galaxy, the message spread. The Imperator was dead. The Empire, once thought eternal, had fallen. The few remaining warlords fled into deep space, hunted shadows of a bygone era. And humanity, once mocked, once dismissed, had carved its legend into the bones of history. On a secure channel, Graves gave the final order. Mission complete. Let's go home. And in the darkness, the Boogeymen vanished once more.